Hi, this is Iain MacCormick looking out of the window on a very sunny day in Oban. In 1978, the Scotland Act was passed. But it was passed with a proviso that it would only come into effect after a referendum in Scotland. And a Labour MP called George Cunningham was able, unfortunately using the procedures of the House of Commons, to insert a clause which meant that there had to be 40% of the whole electorate of Scotland in favour before it would count as being a vote for devolution. It was very unfortunate. I was there when it happened. John Smith was making the final speech for the government on that occasion. And if you speak up until 10 o'clock, or in those days that was the rule, right up till 10 o'clock, nothing else could happen. Unfortunately, he sat down a few seconds before 10 o'clock, and this man, Cunningham, jumped up and caused all the trouble. Now, it proved that 40% was not possible to achieve. I think that the end result was about 32% or thereabouts of the total electorate had voted for devolution. And that was why, basically, that the whole thing collapsed. And in 1979, Jim Callaghan made the drastic blunder of having his election at the wrong time, and the SNP were virtually wiped off the map. From my point of view, it was a very serious circumstance. I'm not the kind of person who looks forward to failure. It had never even crossed my mind that we would lose the election in Argyll. So therefore, there was I, in a state of clinical depression, more or less, because it was such an unexpected catastrophe for me. I wasn't the only person who was disillusioned with the political scene as I saw it, and disillusioned to some extent with my own party, for that matter. That was at the stage when Shirley Williams and Roy Jenkins and David Owen decided to set up the SDP. Now, it was a brand new thing. It was mainly made up of people who had no interest in politics up until that time. It had a different approach from the Labour Party or any of the other parties, for that matter. I was greatly attracted to it and decided to join it, my viewpoint being that that would be the ideal way now, or then rather, of furthering the cause of devolution in Scotland. And in point of fact, I think, although I know I hurt the feelings of many people in the SNP and so on, but I think I was right, because what happened, very shortly after that, the SDP were getting 50% at the polls, and it was only because of the outbreak of the Falklands War that suddenly it collapsed completely. And eventually, well, the SDP ceased to exist and I returned to the fold of the SNP. But in the interim, at conferences and so on in the SDP, we made it definitely part of the SDP policy for proper devolution for Scotland. And if you think about it, one of the SDP's important legacies was on the Labour Party itself, because I think what they call New Labour really grew out of the sort of feelings that the SDP had started. And of course it was New Labour that eventually brought in a reasonable measure of devolution. When one looks back at what was being offered in the 1970s, it's really laughable. In time, the SNP began to win back seats, people like Andrew Welsh and Margaret Ewing. So things began to look up. And then the leadership of the Labour Party, people like Donald Dewar and John Smith, by this time were coming to the fore, and they were going to push for devolution too. When I was in Parliament, I was always very much a devolutionist. Some of the SNP weren't. And that was always, I think, a slight source of tension, particularly after the 1979 election. People could blame one side or the other for the lack of impact. But certainly, in those days, what I'm talking about now, devolution was, I think, regarded by everyone as the main point. I think, for example, I shouldn't be speaking for him, but I think in those days Alex Salmond could be portrayed as a devolutionist. It was a while before the SNP began to make real inroads again. It's probably true, with regard to devolution, for example, it becomes apparent what powers are missing rather than what powers they have. And I think that is a situation we're still in today. Once you have an institution, people's instinct is to make sure that institution has suitable power. The SNP has always gone through cycles of popularity and less popularity. In the 90s, of course, that was when eventually devolution was granted by the Westminster government under Tony Blair and Donald Dewar as the first minister in Scotland. So that was the real turnaround.